When Jacqueline walked into her childhood home and found the empty picture frames scattered across the living room floor, she knew something terrible had happened. But nothing could have prepared her for what her stepmother said next. She's forgotten now, just like she should be. What Victoria didn't know was that destroying those photos would trigger a legal nightmare she never saw coming.
I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Jacqueline Martinez had been dreading this moment for 3 months. Standing in the driveway of the house where she'd grown up in Cedar Falls, Minnesota, she clutched the spare key her father had given her years ago. The familiar 2-story colonial looked exactly the same from the outside. Same blue shutters, same oak tree in the front yard where her mother used to hang wind chimes. But everything had changed since her father married Victoria Blackwood 18 months ago. The marriage had happened so fast. Robert Martinez had met Victoria at a grief counseling group just 2 years after losing his wife Elena to cancer. Jacqueline had tried to be supportive, knowing her father was lonely, but something about Victoria had always felt off. The woman was charming enough in public, always wearing designer clothes and flashing her perfect smile at church functions and neighborhood barbecues. But Jacqueline noticed how Victoria's eyes would go cold whenever anyone mentioned Elena, how she'd quickly change the subject or find an excuse to leave the room. Today's visit wasn't planned. Jacqueline had driven the 4 hours from Minneapolis after receiving a frantic call from Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, who'd seen Victoria loading boxes into a truck in the backyard. When Mrs. Henderson mentioned seeing what looked like photo albums being thrown into a dumpster, Jacqueline's blood had run cold. The front door opened before she could even insert the key. Victoria stood there in her pristine white blouse and perfectly styled blonde hair, looking like she'd been expecting this confrontation. "Jacqueline, what a surprise," Victoria said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Your father didn't mention you were coming." "Dad's at the hardware convention in Chicago until Thursday. You know that." Jacqueline pushed past Victoria into the house. "Mrs. Henderson called me. She said you were throwing things away." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment. "Oh, that busybody. I was just doing some spring cleaning. This house was so cluttered with old junk." Jacqueline's eyes immediately went to the mantelpiece above the fireplace. For 23 years, that mantel had displayed a collection of family photos. Her parents' wedding picture, vacation shots from their trip to Yellowstone, Jacqueline's high school graduation with both parents beaming beside her. Now it was empty, except for a single new photo, Victoria and Robert from their honeymoon in Cabo. "Where are the pictures?" Jacqueline's voice was barely a whisper. "What pictures, dear?" "Don't play dumb with me, Victoria. The family photos, Mom's pictures, where are they?" Victoria walked over to the mantel and adjusted the honeymoon photo, making sure it was perfectly centered. "Oh, those old things. I got rid of them. It was time." The words hit Jacqueline like a physical blow. "You got rid of them? Those weren't yours to get rid of." "Actually, they were." Victoria turned around, and now her mask was completely off. The fake sweetness was gone, replaced by cold calculation. "This is my house now. I'm your father's wife. And frankly, it was unhealthy for him to keep dwelling on the past." Jacqueline felt her knees go weak. Those photos weren't just pictures. They were the only physical memories she had left of her mother. Elena had died when Jacqueline was just 19, and in the chaos of grief and funeral arrangements, most of her mother's personal belongings had been packed away. The photos on the mantel were the daily reminders that Elena Martinez had existed, had loved, had been part of this family. "You had no right," Jacqueline said, her voice shaking with rage. "Those photos meant everything to Dad, to me. They were our memories of Mom." Victoria laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "Memories? Of a dead woman? Jacqueline, your father has moved on. He's happy now.
Those pictures were just keeping him trapped in the past, keeping him from fully embracing our new life together. Our new life? This was Mom's house. She picked out every piece of furniture, painted every room, planted every flower in that garden. And now it's mine. Victoria's voice was ice cold. Your mother is gone, Jacqueline. She's been gone for 4 years. It's time everyone accepted that and moved forward. Jacqueline rushed toward the hallway, hoping against hope that maybe Victoria was lying, that maybe the photos were just moved somewhere else. She yanked open the hall closet where her mother used to keep photo albums. Empty. She ran upstairs to her parents' bedroom, checking the dresser where her mother's jewelry box used to sit alongside framed pictures of the family. Nothing. Victoria had followed her upstairs, watching with cruel amusement as Jacqueline desperately searched through rooms that had been stripped of every trace of Elena. "Looking for something?" Victoria asked from the doorway. Jacqueline spun around. What did you do with everything? Her jewelry, her books, her clothes? Donated most of it, threw away the rest. Really, Jacqueline, you should be thanking me. Your father was becoming a shrine keeper, and that's not healthy for anyone. A shrine keeper? Those were memories. That was Mom's life. Victoria stepped into the room and sat on the bed that had once belonged to Jacqueline's parents. Your mother's life ended 4 years ago. This is my life now, mine and your father's, and I won't have a dead woman's ghost haunting our marriage. The casual cruelty of it took Jacqueline's breath away. You're sick, you know that. You're actually sick. I'm practical. Victoria examined her manicured nails. Your father was stuck in the past, and frankly, so were you. Coming here every few weeks, talking about your mother like she was still alive, encouraging your father to keep her memory shrine intact. It was preventing him from healing. Dad loved those pictures. He looked at them every morning with his coffee. Your father loves me now, and if he truly wants to be happy in this marriage, he needs to let go of his first wife, completely. Jacqueline felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of this woman. You're sick, you know that. You're actually sick. I'm practical. Victoria examined her manicured nails. Your father was stuck in the past, and frankly, so were you. Coming here every few weeks, talking about your mother like she was still alive, encouraging your father to keep her memory shrine intact. It was preventing him from healing. Dad loved those pictures. He looked at them every morning with his coffee. Your father loves me now, and if he truly wants to be happy in this marriage, he needs to let go of his first wife, completely. Jacqueline felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to cry in front of this woman. When he finds out what you did, he'll never forgive you. Victoria's smile returned, but it was sharper now, more predatory. Oh, sweetheart, your father isn't going to find out, because you're not going to tell him.
Like hell I'm not. Think about it, Jacqueline. Your father is finally happy. Really, truly happy for the first time since your mother got sick. Do you really want to destroy that happiness? Do you want to be responsible for ruining his chance at love again? The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that Jacqueline almost fell for it. Almost. But then she thought about her father's morning routine, how he'd sit at the kitchen table with his coffee and look at the photo of him and Elena on their anniversary, the one where her mother was wearing that blue dress she loved, how he'd smile sadly and whisper, "Good morning, mi amor," before starting his day. He deserves to know the truth, Jacqueline said firmly. Victoria's expression hardened. The truth? The truth is that your mother is dead and buried, and it's time everyone moved on. She's forgotten now, just like she should be. And if you try to stir up trouble in my marriage, you'll regret it. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Your father has to choose between his new life with me and his old life with her memory, and I've made sure there's nothing left of that old life to choose. Jacqueline stared at this woman who had systematically erased every trace of her mother from the house Elena had called home for 15 years. The cruelty of it was breathtaking, but what was worse was the calculated nature of it all.
Victoria hadn't acted in a moment of jealous rage. This had been planned, methodical, designed to eliminate any competition from a dead woman's memory. "You're going to regret this," Jacqueline said quietly. Victoria laughed again. "Really? And what exactly are you going to do about it? Call the police? Tell them your stepmother cleaned the house? Sue me for throwing away old photographs? Good luck with that, dear." But as Jacqueline walked out of that house, her mind was already working. Victoria might think she'd covered her tracks perfectly, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated how much those photos meant to the people who loved Elena Martinez. And she'd definitely underestimated Jacqueline's determination to make things right. The first call Jacqueline made from her car was to Thomas Bradley, the family attorney who had handled her mother's estate. The second call was to her father's insurance company, because while Victoria thought she'd destroyed evidence of Elena's existence, what she'd actually done was destroy valuable property that didn't legally belong to her. And that was going to cost her more than she could possibly imagine. Thomas Bradley had been practicing law for 32 years, and in all that time, he'd seen his share of family disputes. But when Jacqueline Martinez walked into his downtown Minneapolis office on Tuesday morning, he could see this case would be different. The young woman sitting across from his mahogany desk had the same determined expression her mother Elena had worn during the difficult months of estate planning before her death. "Tell me everything," Thomas said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He'd handled Elena's will, helped the family navigate the insurance claims, and had watched Robert Martinez struggle through his grief. The news that Robert's new wife had destroyed Elena's photographs was more than shocking. It was potentially criminal. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Jacqueline recounted her confrontation with Victoria, her voice steady despite the obvious pain. Thomas took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification about dates, witnesses, and the specific items that had been destroyed. "Mrs. Henderson saw Victoria loading boxes into a truck?" Thomas asked. "Yes, and she specifically mentioned seeing photo albums being thrown into a dumpster. When I got there, every single picture of my mother was gone. Wedding photos, family portraits, vacation pictures, everything." Thomas leaned back in his leather chair. "Jacqueline, I need to ask you some difficult questions. Did your father give Victoria explicit permission to dispose of these items?" "Dad doesn't even know what happened yet. He's been at a convention in Chicago all week. Besides, those photos weren't just his property. Many of them belonged to Mom's estate, which makes me the legal heir to half of them." This was the crucial detail Thomas had been hoping to hear. When Elena Martinez had drafted her will 4 years ago, she'd been meticulous about protecting her daughter's inheritance. While the house and most assets had gone to Robert, Elena had specifically designated all personal effects, photographs, and sentimental items to be held in joint ownership between her husband and daughter. "Do you have documentation proving your ownership claim?" Thomas asked. Jacqueline reached into her purse and pulled out a folder she'd retrieved from her apartment safe the night before. Mom's will specifically mentions photographs and personal memorabilia. She wanted to make sure I'd always have access to our family memories. Thomas reviewed the documents, his expression growing more serious with each page. Elena's will was ironclad. Any disposal of the designated personal effects required written consent from both Robert and Jacqueline. Victoria had violated the terms of the estate by destroying property that legally belonged to both her husband and stepdaughter. "This changes everything," Thomas said. "We're not just talking about a family disagreement anymore. This is destruction of estate property, which carries significant legal penalties." Over the next hour, Thomas outlined their options. They could pursue civil damages for the destroyed property, particularly if any of the photographs had monetary value, as family heirlooms or historical documents. More importantly, they could seek an injunction preventing Victoria from disposing of any additional estate items and potentially pursue criminal charges for willful destruction of property.
But first, Thomas said, we need to document exactly what was destroyed and establish its value. Do you have any duplicates of the photographs, insurance records, anything that proves what existed? Jacqueline's face lit up for the first time since entering his office. Actually, yes, Mom was really organized about documenting everything. She had a detailed inventory of all family photographs, and she kept digital copies of the most important ones on a cloud storage account that she shared with me. This was better than Thomas had dared hope. With documented proof of what had been destroyed, they could build a compelling case for both criminal charges and civil damages. There's something else, Jacqueline continued. When Mom was going through treatment, she had all the family photos professionally appraised for insurance purposes. Some of the older ones, especially the ones from her grandparents' wedding in the 1940s, were worth several $1,000s as vintage photographs. Thomas made additional notes. Destroying photographs with documented monetary value elevated the case from simple property destruction to a more serious charge. In Minnesota, willful destruction of property worth over $1,000 was a felony. I want you to go home and compile everything, the digital copies, the appraisal documents, the insurance records, everything that proves what existed and what it was worth. Meanwhile, I'm going to file for an emergency injunction to prevent Victoria from disposing of any additional estate property. As Jacqueline was leaving, Thomas called after her. One more thing. Don't contact your father or Victoria yet. We need to handle this through proper legal channels now. The next morning, Victoria Blackwood was having her usual breakfast of Greek yogurt and fresh berries when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, and Robert wasn't due back from Chicago until that afternoon. Through the peephole, she saw a young man in a suit holding an official-looking envelope. "Victoria Blackwood?" the process server asked when she opened the door. "Yes." "You've been served with a temporary restraining order and a summons to appear in court. Have a good day, ma'am." Victoria stared at the legal documents with growing horror. The emergency injunction prohibited her from removing, destroying, or disposing of any personal property that had belonged to Elena Martinez or was designated as part of Elena's estate. Violation of the order could result in immediate arrest and contempt of court charges. But it was the second document that made her hands shake. A civil lawsuit filed by Jacqueline Martinez, seeking damages for the willful destruction of estate property valued at over $15,000. The lawsuit listed specific photographs that had been destroyed, complete with insurance appraisals and documentation proving their value as both sentimental and monetary assets. Victoria sank onto the living room couch, her mind racing. How could Jacqueline possibly prove what had been destroyed? She'd made sure to dispose of everything in a dumpster across town, and she'd even thrown away the old photo albums and frames. There was no evidence left of what had existed. Or so she thought. Her phone rang, interrupting her panic. The caller ID showed Robert's number. "Honey, I just got the strangest call." Robert's voice sounded confused and worried. "Jacqueline's lawyer contacted me about some legal matter involving Mom's photos. He says I need to come back immediately because there's a court hearing tomorrow. What's this about?" Victoria's carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. She'd assumed that by destroying the physical evidence, she could deny everything. But she'd never considered that Elena might have documented everything so thoroughly, or that the photographs themselves might have legal protection as estate property. I don't know what this is about," Victoria lied. "Maybe it's some kind of misunderstanding." "Thomas Bradley doesn't file lawsuits over misunderstandings, Victoria. He was Elena's attorney, and he's very thorough. If he's involved in the courts, something serious has happened."
Victoria could hear the suspicion creeping into her husband's voice. Robert Martinez was a gentleman, but he wasn't stupid. He'd trusted her completely, never questioning her decisions about the house or their belongings. But now, faced with legal action involving his late wife's estate, he was starting to ask the questions Victoria had hoped he'd never think to ask. "Where are the photos, Victoria?" Robert asked quietly. "The ones from the mantel, from the bedroom, from the hall closet. I haven't really looked for them since I've been busy with work, but Jacqueline's lawyer is asking about specific pictures. Where are they?" Victoria closed her eyes, realizing that her next words would determine the fate of her marriage. She could continue lying, hope that somehow the legal case would fall apart, and pray that Robert would never discover the truth. Or she could try to salvage the situation by admitting to some of what she'd done while minimizing the scope of her actions. But before she could answer, she heard Robert's sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Oh my God," he whispered. "You threw them away. You threw away Elena's pictures? That's what this lawsuit is about." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Victoria realized that her silence had already given him his answer. Robert Martinez drove the 4 hours from Chicago to Cedar Falls in complete silence, his mind replaying every conversation he'd had with Victoria over the past 18 months. The pieces were falling into place now. Her subtle comments about moving forward, her insistence on redecorating the bedroom, her suggestion that he donate Elena's jewelry to help other families. He thought she was being considerate, helping him heal. Now he realized she'd been systematically erasing his first wife's existence. He pulled into the driveway at 3:47 p.m., noting that Victoria's BMW wasn't there. The house felt different as he walked through the front door, colder, emptier. His eyes immediately went to the mantelpiece, and for the first time in months, he truly saw what was missing. The wedding photo, where Elena had been laughing so hard at his terrible joke that she'd nearly dropped her bouquet. The picture of their first Christmas in this house, where Elena had insisted on hanging mistletoe in every doorway. The family portrait from Jacqueline's high school graduation, where all three of them looked so proud and happy. All gone. Replaced by a single photo of him and Victoria in Cabo, a trip he now remembered feeling oddly hollow about. At the time, he'd attributed his lack of enthusiasm to guilt about moving on. Now he wondered if part of him had sensed what Victoria was really doing. His phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Bradley. "Court hearing moved to 2 p.m. tomorrow. Jacqueline will meet you at my office at 1 p.m. to review evidence. Bring any documentation you have regarding Elena's personal effects." Robert walked upstairs to his bedroom and opened the closet where Elena's jewelry box had sat for 15 years. Empty space. He checked the dresser drawer where she'd kept letters from her mother in Mexico. Nothing. The bookshelf where Elena had displayed her collection of vintage postcards from their travels. Bare. The methodical nature of the eraser was breathtaking. Victoria hadn't just removed a few pictures. She'd eliminated every trace of Elena Martinez from the house where Elena lived and loved and dreamed of growing old with her husband. Robert's phone rang. "Victoria. Honey, where are you? I went to the grocery store and came back to find your car in the driveway." "I'm in the bedroom," Robert said quietly, "looking at all the empty spaces where my wife's belongings used to be." A long pause. "Robert, we should talk about this." "Yes, we should. Come home." 20 minutes later, Victoria walked into the bedroom where Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the only photograph of Elena he'd managed to find, a small wallet-sized picture from her purse that she must have overlooked. "I can explain," Victoria began. "Explain what? How did you throw away 15 years of memories? How do you destroy photographs that belonged to my daughter? How have you lied to my face every single day for months?" Victoria sat down beside him, her voice taking on the gentle tone she used when she wanted something. "Robert, I know this looks bad, but I was only thinking of your healing process. You were stuck, honey, trapped by all those reminders of the past. I wanted to help you move forward." "Move forward?" Robert's voice was incredulous. "Victoria, those weren't just reminders of the past. They were proof that Elena existed, that our love mattered, that the 20 years we spent together had value. You didn't help me heal. You tried to erase the most important part of my life." "That's not fair. I'm the most important part of your life now. We're married, Robert. This is our house, our life together." Robert stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where Elena had spent countless hours planting roses and herbs. Even there, he noticed now, Victoria had made changes. Elena's herb garden had been replaced with decorative gravel. The rose bushes Elena had nursed through 5 Minnesota winters, gone. "When did you remove the roses?" he asked. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. "Last month. They weren't doing well, and I thought the yard needed updating." Those roses were Elena's prize possession. She'd grafted some of those varieties herself, and they were doing fine. Mrs. Henderson complimented them just 6 weeks ago when I talked to her. "Robert, you're being unreasonable. They were just plants." He turned around to her, and Victoria saw something in his expression that made her step back. The gentle, grieving widower she'd married was gone, replaced by a man who was finally seeing clearly.
Just plants, just photographs, just memories, just the woman who loved me for 20 years and gave me the most beautiful daughter in the world. Robert's voice was steady, but there was steel in it now. "Tell me something, Victoria. When you decided to marry me, did you actually love me, or did you just see a lonely widower with a nice house and a decent pension?" "Of course I love you. Everything I did was because I love you." "No," Robert shook his head. "Everything you did was because you couldn't stand sharing me with Elena's memory. You were jealous of a dead woman, Victoria. So jealous that you committed felony destruction of property to eliminate the competition." Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. "Yes, I was jealous. Do you have any idea what it's like being married to a ghost? Every morning you'd sit at that kitchen table and look at her picture. Every time we made love, I wondered if you were thinking about her. Every decision about this house had to be filtered through what would Elena have wanted. I was tired of being the runner-up in my own marriage." The raw honesty of her confession was more damaging than any lie she could have told. Robert stared at his wife of 18 months and realized he was looking at a stranger. "So you decided to solve the problem by destroying everything that proved she ever existed?" "I decided to give our marriage a real chance." Victoria's voice was rising now, desperation creeping in. "Without all those constant reminders, you could have learned to love me the way you loved her." "The way I loved her?" Robert's laugh was bitter. "Victoria, the way I loved Elena is exactly why I could never love you. She celebrated my memories, my past, my growth as a person. When her cancer came back the second time, she spent weeks making photo albums for Jacqueline and me because she wanted to make sure we'd always have those memories to cherish. She knew that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it grows." He walked to the dresser and picked up the wedding photo of him and Victoria. "You know what the difference is between you and Elena? She understood that marrying a widower means marrying someone whose capacity for love was proven, not threatened by a previous relationship. You saw Elena as competition. Elena would have seen you as proof that I was capable of love." Victoria was crying now, but her tears were angry rather than remorseful. "It's easy to make a dead woman sound like a saint, Robert, but I'm here. I'm real. I'm the one who's been taking care of you, cooking your meals, sharing your bed. Doesn't that count for anything?" "It might have," Robert said sadly, "if you hadn't built our entire relationship on the systematic destruction of my family's history. Do you understand what you've done, Victoria? Those photographs weren't just pictures. They were Jacqueline's inheritance from her mother. They were the only way my grandchildren would have been able to see their grandmother. You didn't just rob me, you robbed generations of our family." The full weight of her actions seemed to hit Victoria for the first time. She'd been so focused on eliminating Elena as a rival, she'd never considered the broader impact of her choices. I didn't think about future grandchildren," she whispered. "No, you didn't think about anything except your own insecurity. And now my daughter is taking you to court, and rightfully so." Robert picked up his keys from the dresser. "I'm going to stay at the Hampton Inn tonight. Tomorrow, I'm going to court to support Jacqueline's lawsuit against you. And then we're going to discuss the future of this marriage." "Robert, please, we can work through this. I'll make it right somehow." He paused at the bedroom door. "Victoria,
You threw away irreplaceable family photographs because you couldn't handle being married to someone who had loved before. There's no coming back from that. Some things, once destroyed, can never be made right. As Robert drove away, Victoria finally understood that her war against Elena's memory had cost her everything she thought she was fighting to protect. The Hennepin County Courthouse was busier than usual for a Wednesday afternoon, but Courtroom 4B felt surprisingly intimate for such a momentous occasion. Jacqueline sat beside Thomas Bradley at the plaintiff's table, a thick folder of evidence spread before them. Across the aisle, Victoria had arrived with Marcus Webb, a defense attorney she'd hired after spending most of Tuesday night frantically Googling property destruction lawyers Minneapolis. Robert had chosen to sit in the gallery behind Jacqueline, a decision that spoke volumes about where his loyalties now lay. Victoria had glanced back at him twice since entering the courtroom, but he'd avoided her eyes both times. Judge Patricia Chen called the session to order at exactly 2 p.m. She was known throughout the Twin Cities legal community for her no-nonsense approach and her particular sensitivity to cases involving family estates and inheritance disputes. "We're here today for Martinez v. Blackwood," Judge Chen announced, reviewing her notes. "This is a civil action seeking damages for alleged destruction of estate property. Mr. Bradley, you may present your opening statement." Thomas stood and approached the bench with the confidence of someone who'd spent weeks building an airtight case. "Your Honor, this case is about more than damaged property. It's about the deliberate and malicious destruction of a family's history by someone who should have been protecting that legacy." He gestured toward an easel where he'd mounted blown-up copies of some of Elena's photographs, all recovered from the digital archives she'd carefully maintained. Elena Martinez spent 20 years creating and documenting her family's memories. When she became ill, she took extraordinary steps to protect these photographs, having them professionally appraised and designating them as shared property between her husband and daughter in her will. The judge studied the photographs with interest. Wedding pictures, vacation shots, family portraits spanning 2 decades. Even in their enlarged format, the love and joy in the images was unmistakable. 18 months after Mrs. Martinez's death, Thomas continued, the defendant, Victoria Blackwood, systematically destroyed these irreplaceable family heirlooms. She acted not out of ignorance, but out of calculated jealousy toward a deceased woman's memory. Thomas presented his evidence methodically. Elena's will, clearly designating the photographs as joint property. The professional appraisal documents, showing total value of $18,350 for the vintage and historically significant images. Insurance records documenting the existence and condition of specific photographs. Digital copies proving exactly what had been destroyed. Most damning of all, Thomas said, holding up a printed transcript, is the defendant's own admission, recorded during a conversation with the plaintiff, where she stated, and I quote, "She's forgotten now, just like she should be." Judge Chen raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Bradley, do you have verification of this recording?" "Yes, Your Honor. Minnesota is a one-party consent for recording conversations. Miss Martinez was well within her legal rights to document this conversation using her smartphone. Jacqueline had been smart enough to start recording when Victoria's behavior became threatening. The audio quality was clear, and Victoria's voice was unmistakable as she admitted to destroying the photographs and expressed no remorse for her actions." Marcus Webb's defense was predictably weak. He argued that Victoria had acted within her rights as the new spouse to redecorate and organize their home. He claimed the photographs had no actual monetary value beyond their insurance appraisals, which he characterized as inflated for coverage purposes. "Your Honor," Webb argued, "my client was simply trying to help her husband move forward with his life. The destruction of these photographs was not malicious, but rather an unfortunate misunderstanding about property rights." Judge Chen was not impressed. "Mr. Webb, your client destroyed property that was legally designated as belonging to both her husband and his daughter. Are you arguing that she was unaware of the terms of the deceased wife's will?" Webb shifted uncomfortably. "The will was never specifically discussed with my client. Then she should have inquired about property rights before destroying valuable items that didn't belong entirely to her husband," the judge replied curtly. The proceedings took a dramatic turn when Thomas called Robert Martinez to the witness stand. Robert had been reluctant to testify against his wife, but the previous day's confrontation had solidified his resolve to support his daughter. Mr. Martinez, Thomas began, did you give your wife permission to dispose of the family photographs? No, I did not, Robert answered clearly. I was at a business convention in Chicago. I had no idea what Victoria was doing until after it was done. In your opinion, what was the sentimental value of these photographs to your family? Robert's voice grew thick with emotion. They were priceless. Those pictures were the only way my future grandchildren would have been able to see their grandmother. Elena spent her last months organizing those photos specifically so Jacqueline and I would always have them. Did your wife ever express jealousy or resentment about the photographs? Marcus Webb objected, but Judge Chen overruled him, noting that the question went directly to the defendant's state of mind and intent. Robert took a deep breath. Yes, Victoria often made comments about me being stuck in the past and suggested that keeping Elena's photos was preventing me from fully embracing our new life together. I thought she was trying to help me heal, but now I understand she was planning to eliminate anything that reminded me of my first marriage. The most powerful moment came when Thomas presented Elena's final letter to Jacqueline, written during her last stay in the hospital. Elena had given the sealed letter to Thomas with instructions that it only be opened if there were ever legal disputes about her personal effects. My dearest Jacqueline, Thomas read aloud, I know that someday your father will find love again, and I hope he does. When that day comes, I want you to remember that our family's history doesn't diminish someone else's future, it enriches it. The photographs and memories we've created together are not competition for new love, they are proof that love continues even when life ends. Protect these memories, not just for yourself, but for the grandchildren I will never meet, and the great-grandchildren whose faces I will never see. Our family story doesn't end with my death, it continues through you. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, including Judge Chen, who had to pause for a moment to compose herself. When Victoria took the stand in her own defense, her testimony only made things worse. Under Thomas's cross-examination, she became defensive and angry, repeating many of the same cruel statements she'd made during the recorded conversation with Jacqueline. Mrs. Blackwood, Thomas asked, do you feel any remorse for destroying these family heirlooms? I feel remorse that it's caused problems in my marriage, Victoria replied, but I still believe Robert needed to move forward from dwelling on his dead wife. So you don't regret the destruction itself, only the consequences you're now facing? Victoria's lawyer tried to object, but she'd already answered. Those photographs were keeping Robert trapped in grief. I freed him from that burden. Judge Chen's expression grew increasingly stern throughout Victoria's testimony. When it concluded, she called a brief recess to review the evidence. 20 minutes later, the court reconvened for the verdict. Judge Chen's voice was measured but firm as she delivered her ruling. In the matter of Martinez v. Blackwood, I find for the plaintiff on all counts. The defendant willfully destroyed property valued at $18,350 that was legally owned by both Robert Martinez and Jacqueline Martinez, under the clear terms of Elena Martinez's will. The defendant's actions were not accidental or well-intentioned, but were motivated by jealousy and a calculated desire to eliminate evidence of the deceased wife's existence. The judge ordered Victoria to pay full damages of $18,350 plus court costs and attorney fees. But more significantly, she referred the case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges, noting that the destruction of estate property worth over $1,000 constituted felony criminal damage in Minnesota. As the gavel fell, Victoria finally understood that her attempt to erase Elena's memory had instead immortalized it in court records and legal precedent. She'd lost her marriage, her financial security, and potentially her freedom, all because she couldn't accept sharing her husband's heart with the memory of a woman who had only ever wished her well. 3 weeks after the civil judgment, Victoria Blackwood sat in the sterile waiting room of the Hennepin County District Attorney's Office, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of lukewarm coffee. The criminal charges had been filed exactly as Judge Chen had promised: felony destruction of property, theft by taking, and criminal damage to estate assets. What had started as Victoria's petty jealousy had escalated into potential prison time. Her attorney, Marcus Webb, looked as uncomfortable as she felt. The civil case had been a disaster, and criminal court would be even worse since the prosecution could now use Victoria's own recorded statements and courtroom testimony as evidence of criminal intent.
Mrs. Blackwood, Assistant District Attorney Sarah Kim called from the doorway, "We're ready for you." The plea negotiations had been going on for a week. Victoria faced up to 3 years in prison if convicted on all charges, plus mandatory restitution that would exceed the civil judgment since criminal restitution included punitive damages. Her only hope was to accept a plea deal that would reduce the charges in exchange for a guilty plea. Meanwhile, across town, Jacqueline sat in Thomas Bradley's office reviewing the paperwork for a different kind of justice. The $18,350 judgment was just the beginning. Robert had filed for divorce the day after the court ruling, and Minnesota's equitable distribution laws meant Victoria would lose most of her claim to the marital assets. "The house will revert to your father," Thomas explained. "Since it was owned free and clear before the marriage, and Elena's will specifically protected it as part of your inheritance, Victoria has no valid claim to it. Her only marital asset will be half of whatever equity she and your father built during their 18-month marriage, which amounts to about $12,000. But the real victory had come in an unexpected form. Mrs. Henderson, the observant neighbor who had first alerted Jacqueline to Victoria's destructive rampage, had been following the case closely. 2 days after the civil trial, she'd called Jacqueline with stunning news. "I saved them," Mrs. Henderson had said simply. "The photo albums. I saw that woman throwing them in the dumpster, and something just didn't sit right with me. I waited until she left, then I climbed in there and pulled them out. Figured I'd return them when the dust settled." The elderly woman had rescued 3 complete photo albums and a shoebox full of loose pictures. While many individual framed photos had been destroyed beyond recovery, the core of Elena's carefully curated family history had survived Victoria's rampage. Jacqueline had cried for an hour when Mrs. Henderson handed over the rescued albums. There was her parents' wedding day, vacation pictures from Yellowstone, Elena's 40th birthday party where she'd laughed so hard at Robert's surprise mariachi band that she'd snorted champagne. Most precious of all was a leather-bound album Elena had titled "For My Future Grandchildren," photos spanning Jacqueline's entire childhood with handwritten notes explaining each memory. The discovery had shifted the entire dynamic of the case. Victoria's destruction hadn't been complete, which actually made her actions seem even more petty and vindictive. She'd thrown away family treasures that could have been preserved simply by asking, proving that her motivation was cruelty rather than ignorance. Robert had moved back into the family home after Victoria moved out to stay with her sister in Bloomington. The house felt different now, not just because Victoria's presence was gone, but because Robert was actively working to restore Elena's memory to its rightful place. He'd reprinted and reframed many of the recovered photos, but more importantly, he'd begun talking about Elena again without the guilt and hesitation that had characterized his conversations during his marriage to Victoria. "I realized something during the trial," Robert told Jacqueline as they worked together to reorganize the photo albums one evening. "Victoria wasn't wrong that I was stuck in grief, but she was completely wrong about the solution. I didn't need to forget Elena to move forward. I needed to properly honor her memory so I could love again without guilt." The criminal case concluded on a rainy Thursday in November. Victoria accepted a plea deal that reduced the felony charges to misdemeanor destruction of property in exchange for her guilty plea, 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and full criminal restitution of $25,000. The judge also ordered her to attend anger management counseling and prohibited her from contacting the Martinez family for 5 years. Outside the courthouse, Victoria's sister, Patricia, tried to paint her as a victim of circumstance. "She was just trying to help Robert move on," Patricia told a local news reporter who had picked up the story. "This whole thing has been blown out of proportion." But the reporter had done her homework. She'd interviewed Mrs. Henderson, reviewed the court records, and listened to excerpts from the recorded conversation between Victoria and Jacqueline. The resulting story, titled When Love Turns to Destruction, A Stepmother's War Against Memory, painted Victoria as exactly what she was, a woman whose jealousy had driven her to commit crimes against her own family. The story went viral on social media, picked up by grief counseling websites and legal blogs as an example of how not to handle blended family dynamics. Victoria Blackwood became a cautionary tale about the destructive power of jealousy and insecurity. 6 months later, Jacqueline received an unexpected phone call from a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation to the judge who had ruled in their favor. Margaret was a professional archivist who specialized in family photograph restoration and preservation. "I read about your case online," Margaret explained. "I work with families to digitize and preserve their photo collections, and I'd like to donate my services to help restore what was damaged and protect what remains." Working with Margaret, Jacqueline and Robert created a comprehensive digital archive of Elena's photographs, complete with the stories and context that Elena had so carefully documented. They had prints made for family members, created backup copies in multiple locations, and even established a small scholarship fund at Elena's alma mater in her memory. The process of rebuilding their family's visual history became therapeutic for both Robert and Jacqueline. They spent hours going through the rescued albums, sharing memories that Victoria's actions had actually strengthened rather than destroyed. Robert eventually began dating again, but with a completely different approach than his rushed courtship with Victoria. He was open about Elena's continued importance in his life, and he only pursued relationships with women who understood that loving a widower meant embracing her complete history, not trying to erase parts of it. 2 years after the trial, Robert met Linda Hoffman, a widow who had lost her husband to a heart attack 5 years earlier. Linda not only accepted Elena's place in Robert's heart, but actively encouraged him to share stories about his first wife. She understood that a person's capacity for deep love was something to celebrate, not fear. When Robert and Linda became engaged, one of their first decisions was to include Elena's photograph in their wedding ceremony, acknowledging the love that had shaped Robert into the man Linda had fallen for. It was exactly what Elena would have wanted, her memory honored and integrated into the family's continuing story rather than erased or hidden. Victoria, meanwhile, had moved to Arizona to live with a cousin, unable to find stable employment in Minnesota after her criminal conviction made local news. She'd lost her marriage, her home, her reputation, and nearly $50,000 in legal fees and restitution. Her attempt to destroy Elena's legacy had instead ensured that Elena's story would be preserved and celebrated for generations to come.
On the third anniversary of Elena's death, Jacqueline stood in the garden behind her childhood home, watching her father and Linda plant new roses beside the memorial bush Robert had planted to replace the ones Victoria had destroyed. In her hands, she held the leather photo album titled "For My Future Grandchildren," knowing that someday she would share these pictures and stories with her own children. Victoria had tried to make Elena forget, but instead, she had made Elena's memory stronger, more precious, and more enduring than ever before. Some acts of love, Jacqueline reflected, become more powerful when someone tries to destroy them. Elena's legacy hadn't just survived Victoria's attack, it had emerged more beautiful and meaningful than before. 5 years after the courtroom victory that had changed everything, Jacqueline Martinez Sullivan stood in the nursery of her new home in St. Paul, carefully arranging a collection of framed photographs on the wall above the changing table. Her 3-month-old daughter, Elena Rose, slept peacefully in her crib, unaware that she was surrounded by images of the grandmother she would never meet, but whose love would shape her entire life. The photos told a story spanning generations. Elena Martinez at age 5, grinning gap-toothed beside her own mother in their family's small apartment in East St. Paul. Elena at 16, dressed for her quinceañera in a flowing pink gown that Jacqueline now kept carefully preserved in acid-free storage. Elena on her wedding day, radiant with joy as she danced with Robert at their reception in the church hall where they'd met during a community fundraiser. But it was the final photograph in the sequence that always brought tears to Jacqueline's eyes. A picture taken just 2 weeks before Elena's death, where she sat in her hospital bed holding an ultrasound image that Jacqueline had brought to show her. Elena had been too weak to speak much by then, but her eyes had lit up when she realized she would have a granddaughter. She'd traced the fuzzy outline of the baby with one finger and whispered, "She'll know my stories." The legal victory over Victoria had been just the beginning of a much larger journey. Thomas Bradley had suggested that Jacqueline document the entire experience, both for therapeutic purposes and to help other families facing similar situations. What had started as a personal journal had evolved into a book titled Reclaiming Memory: A Daughter's Fight for Family Legacy, which had been published by University of Minnesota Press and was now used in law schools as a case study in estate protection and family rights. The book's success had led to speaking opportunities at grief counseling centers, law enforcement seminars, and family mediation workshops. Jacqueline had discovered that Victoria's behavior wasn't as unusual as she'd initially thought. Step-parents struggling with jealousy toward deceased former spouses was a surprisingly common problem, though few cases escalated to criminal destruction of property. One of the most meaningful outcomes had been Jacqueline's work with the Minnesota Bar Association to draft new legislation protecting family photographs and personal effects in blended family situations. Elena's Law, as it came to be known, required specific documentation and consent procedures before personal effects from deceased family members could be disposed of by surviving spouses or step-parents. The law had already prevented 3 similar cases from reaching the courts, as attorneys now routinely advise clients about the potential legal consequences of destroying stepchildren's inherited photographs and memorabilia. Robert's life had also transformed in unexpected ways. His relationship with Linda had blossomed into a marriage that honored both their past loves and their future together. Linda had become a fierce protector of Elena's memory, often sharing stories about Elena with people who had never met her. She'd helped Robert create a small memorial garden in their backyard where they held annual remembrance celebrations on Elena's birthday, complete with her favorite Mexican foods and mariachi music. The most surprising development had been Linda's relationship with Jacqueline. Unlike Victoria, who had seen Jacqueline as a threat and reminder of Elena's place in Robert's heart, Linda had embraced her role as a bonus parent. She'd been present for Elena Rose's birth, had helped plan Jacqueline's wedding to Michael Sullivan, and had become the grandmother figure that baby Elena would grow up knowing and loving. "I always tell people I didn't replace Elena," Linda often said when friends asked about the dynamics of their blended family. "I joined a family that was already full of love. Elena's love created the capacity for more love, not less." The contrast with Victoria's approach couldn't have been starker. Where Victoria had tried to eliminate Elena's presence to make room for herself, Linda had expanded the family's capacity for love by celebrating Elena's continued influence on their lives. Victoria herself had largely disappeared from their lives, though occasional updates filtered back through mutual acquaintances. She'd married again in Arizona, this time to a man with no children and no previous marriages. According to her sister Patricia, Victoria had learned from her mistakes and was careful not to discuss past relationships with her new husband. Whether this represented genuine growth or simply more sophisticated manipulation remained unclear. The criminal conviction had followed Victoria for years. Her attempt to work in childcare had been derailed when background checks revealed her criminal record. A job application to work with elderly clients in assisted living had been similarly rejected. She'd eventually found work as a night shift data entry clerk, a position that required minimal human interaction and no background screening. Patricia had reached out to Robert once, about 2 years after the trial, asking if he would consider writing a letter to help Victoria find employment. Robert had politely declined, explaining that while he held no personal animosity toward Victoria, he couldn't in good conscience recommend someone who had deliberately destroyed family property to work in positions of trust with vulnerable populations. The conversation had crystallized something important for Robert. Forgiveness didn't require facilitating someone's ability to repeat harmful behaviors. He'd worked through his anger toward Victoria in counseling, but that healing didn't obligate him to help her rebuild the life she'd destroyed through her own choices. Meanwhile, the rescued photograph albums had become the foundation for an ever-expanding family archive.
Jacqueline had connected with Elena's extended family in Mexico, sharing digital copies of photographs and gathering stories that filled in gaps in the family history. She'd learned about Elena's childhood during summers at her grandmother's ranch, her teenage dreams of becoming a teacher, and her courtship with Robert that had scandalized some family members who thought she was too young to marry at 22. These stories became bedtime tales for Elena Rose, family legends passed down through careful storytelling. The little girl would grow up knowing that her grandmother had once climbed onto the roof of her high school to rescue a kitten, that she'd learned to make tamales by standing on a wooden crate in her mother's kitchen, and that she'd convinced Robert to propose by leaving subtle hints about ring sizes and preferred gemstones for 6 months before he finally caught on. The photographs themselves had been professionally restored and preserved using archival materials that would protect them for centuries. Jacqueline had created multiple copies of everything, storing them in different locations and formats to ensure that no single act of destruction could ever again threaten her family's visual history. She'd also established the Elena Martinez Memorial Photography Fund, which provided grants to low-income families for professional family portraits and photo restoration services. The fund operated on the principle that every family deserved to have their history documented and preserved regardless of their economic circumstances. One of the fund's most successful programs partnered with local hospitals to provide free photography services for families facing terminal illnesses, ensuring that children would have professional photographs with their dying parents. It was exactly the kind of program Elena would have championed, combining her love of family with her instinct to help others during their most difficult moments. As Jacqueline finished arranging the nursery photos, she reflected on how Victoria's destructive act had ultimately led to so much positive change. Elena's story was now preserved not just in family albums, but in legal precedent, published literature, and ongoing charitable work. Victoria's attempt to erase Elena's memory had instead amplified it, creating ripple effects that would help protect other families for generations to come. Baby Elena Rose stirred in her crib, opening dark eyes that looked exactly like her grandmother's. Jacqueline picked up her daughter and settled into the rocking chair that had once belonged to Elena, beginning the lullaby that Elena had sung to Jacqueline 30 years earlier. The melody filled the room where 4 generations of women were connected across time. Elena's mother, who had taught her the song, Elena, who had sung it to Jacqueline, Jacqueline, who now sings it to her daughter, and someday, Elena Rose, who would sing it to her own children. Victoria had tried to break that chain of connection, but she'd only made it stronger. Some bonds, Jacqueline had learned, become unbreakable when someone tries to destroy them. 10 years had passed since Victoria Blackwood destroyed Elena Martinez's photographs in a fit of jealous rage, and the story had become something of a legend in legal circles throughout Minnesota. Thomas Bradley, now nearing retirement, still kept a framed copy of Judge Chen's ruling on his office wall, not because it was his most lucrative case, but because it represented everything he believed about the law's power to protect what matters most to families. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Jacqueline's home office as she put the finishing touches on the 10th anniversary edition of Reclaiming Memory. The updated book would include new chapters about Elena's law, the photography fund's impact, and case studies from other families who had successfully used the legal precedent to protect their own heritage from destructive relatives. 6-year-old Elena Rose burst through the office door, her dark curls bouncing as she ran to her mother's desk. In her small hands, she clutched a drawing she'd made at school, a crayon portrait of 3 women standing together under a rainbow. At the bottom, in careful kindergarten letters, she'd written, "Me, Mommy, and Grandma Elena." "Mrs. Peterson says we're supposed to draw our families," Elena Rose announced proudly. "I told her my grandma lives in heaven, but she still loves me, and she said that's the most beautiful kind of love." Jacqueline's throat tightened with emotion as she examined her daughter's artwork. Elena Rose had never met her grandmother, but she knew Elena's stories by heart. How she'd taught herself to braid hair by practicing on their neighbor's patient golden retriever, how she'd convinced Robert to adopt 3 stray cats by claiming they were just visiting until homes could be found, and that she'd once accidentally dyed all the family's white laundry pink while trying to wash a new red dress. These weren't just stories, they were living connections that shaped Elena's understanding of herself and her family's values.
The little girl who drew her deceased grandmother as a permanent part of her family was growing up with an unshakable sense of belonging and continuity that Victoria's destructive act had inadvertently strengthened. The ripple effects of the legal victory continued to spread in unexpected directions. Dr. Maria Santos, a psychology professor at the University of Minnesota, had incorporated the Martinez case into her research on healthy grief processing in blended families. Her studies showed that children who grew up with integrated narratives about deceased family members demonstrated higher emotional resilience and stronger family bonds than those whose deceased relatives were treated as taboo subjects. The Martinez family became a model for what we now call expansive love, Dr. Santos explained in her recently published research. Instead of viewing the deceased spouse as competition for limited emotional resources, healthy blended families recognize that honoring past love creates capacity for new love. The research had practical applications in family therapy and grief counseling. Therapists now routinely use elements of Elena's story to help blended families navigate the complex emotions surrounding deceased former spouses. The key insight, that trying to erase someone from family history almost always backfires, had prevented countless Victoria-like situations from escalating to legal crises. Robert and Linda's marriage had become a case study in its own right. Marriage counselors frequently referred couples to them when step-parents struggled with jealousy toward deceased former spouses. Robert and Linda had developed a workshop called Room for More Love that they presented at churches and community centers throughout the Midwest. Their approach was remarkably simple. Instead of competing with Elena's memory, Linda had made herself Elena's champion. She'd learned Elena's recipes, continued Elena's traditions, and made sure Elena Rose grew up hearing stories about the grandmother who had loved her before she was even born. Rather than feeling threatened by Elena's continued presence in the family's life, Linda felt honored to be part of preserving and extending Elena's legacy. 10 years had passed since Victoria Blackwood destroyed Elena Martinez's photographs in a fit of jealous rage, and the story had become something of a legend in legal circles throughout Minnesota. Thomas Bradley, now nearing retirement, still kept a framed copy of Judge Chen's ruling on his office wall, not because it was his most lucrative case, but because it represented everything he believed about the law's power to protect what matters most to families. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Jacqueline's home office as she put the finishing touches on the 10th anniversary edition of Reclaiming Memory. The updated book would include new chapters about Elena's law, the photography fund's impact, and case studies from other families who had successfully used the legal precedent to protect their own heritage from destructive relatives. 6-year-old Elena Rose burst through the office door, her dark curls bouncing as she ran to her mother's desk. In her small hands, she clutched a drawing she'd made at school, a crayon portrait of 3 women standing together under a rainbow. At the bottom, in careful kindergarten letters, she'd written, "Me, Mommy, and Grandma Elena." "Mrs. Peterson says we're supposed to draw our families," Elena Rose announced proudly. "I told her my grandma lives in heaven, but she still loves me, and she said that's the most beautiful kind of love." Jacqueline's throat tightened with emotion as she examined her daughter's artwork. Elena Rose had never met her grandmother, but she knew Elena's stories by heart. How she'd taught herself to braid hair by practicing on their neighbor's patient golden retriever, how she'd convinced Robert to adopt 3 stray cats by claiming they were just visiting until homes could be found, how she'd once accidentally dyed all the family's white laundry pink while trying to wash a new red dress. These weren't just stories, they were living connections that shaped Elena's understanding of herself and her family's values. The little girl who drew her deceased grandmother as a permanent part of her family was growing up with an unshakable sense of belonging and continuity that Victoria's destructive act had inadvertently strengthened. The ripple effects of the legal victory continued to spread in unexpected directions. Dr. Maria Santos, a psychology professor at the University of Minnesota, had incorporated the Martinez case into her research on healthy grief processing in blended families. Her studies showed that children who grew up with integrated narratives about deceased family members demonstrated higher emotional resilience and stronger family bonds than those whose deceased relatives were treated as taboo subjects. The research had practical applications in family therapy and grief counseling. Therapists now routinely use elements of Elena's story to help blended families navigate the complex emotions surrounding deceased former spouses. The key insight, that trying to erase someone from family history almost always backfires, had prevented countless Victoria-like situations from escalating to legal crises. Robert and Linda's marriage had become a case study in its own right.
Marriage counselors frequently referred couples to them when step-parents struggled with jealousy toward deceased former spouses. Robert and Linda had developed a workshop called Room for More Love that
I used to worry that Robert would never love me as much as he loved Elena, Linda admitted during one of their workshops. Then I realized that wasn't the right question. The real question was whether I could love a man whose capacity for deep love had been proven by his 20-year marriage to Elena. Once I understood that Elena's place in his heart made more room for love, not less, everything changed. The contrast with Victoria's approach was stark and educational. Where Victoria had seen Elena as an obstacle to overcome, Linda saw her as a foundation to build upon. Where Victoria had demanded exclusive claim to Robert's heart, Linda had celebrated sharing space with Elena's memory. The difference in outcomes spoke volumes about the power of secure versus insecure love. Victoria herself had faded into obscurity, but not without leaving a lasting mark on Minnesota law. Elena's law had been strengthened twice since its original passage, expanding protections for digital assets and requiring mediation before any disposal of inherited family memorabilia. The law now served as a model for other states dealing with similar issues. In a twist that Elena would have appreciated, Victoria's destructive act had ultimately led to stronger protections for thousands of families. Legal scholars estimated that Elena's law had prevented over 200 similar cases from reaching the courts, saving families both emotional trauma and financial devastation. The photography fund had grown beyond anyone's expectations, providing services to over 3,000 families since its inception. The fund's crown jewel was a mobile photography unit that visited hospitals, nursing homes, and hospice facilities, creating professional family portraits for families facing loss. The unit was staffed entirely by volunteers, many of whom had their own stories of treasured family photographs that had helped them through difficult times. One of the most moving testimonials came from a father whose military deployment had been extended indefinitely. The Photography Fund's hospital program had captured precious images of him video calling to read bedtime stories to his newborn daughter, creating a visual record of their bond despite the physical distance. When he was killed in action 3 months later, those photographs became priceless memories for his wife and daughter. Stories like these reminded everyone involved why the legal fight had been so important. Victoria had seen Elena's photographs as threats to her marriage, but they were actually proof of love's permanence and power to transcend death itself. As Elena Rose grew older, she began to understand the significance of her grandmother's story in new ways. During a school project about family heroes, she chose to write about Elena Martinez, not because she was her grandmother, but because she represented something important about love and memory. "My grandma Elena taught me that love doesn't die when people die," Elena wrote in her third-grade essay. "Bad people tried to throw away pictures of her, but good people saved them. Now I know that love is stronger than mean people, and memories are stronger than forgetting." The essay won first place in the school's writing contest, but more importantly, it demonstrated how Elena's legacy lived on in the values she'd instilled in her family. Elena Rose was growing up with an unshakable belief that love persists, that memory matters, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, always leads to something beautiful. On the 10th anniversary of the court ruling, Jacqueline received an unexpected letter. It was from a woman named Catherine Walsh in Oregon, whose stepmother had threatened to destroy family photographs after Catherine's father's death. Catherine had read about Elena's law online and contacted a local attorney who helped her file an injunction before any damage could be done. "Your family's courage saved my family's history," Catherine wrote. "Because you fought for your mother's memory, my children will grow up knowing their grandfather's story. Elena's law protected what can never be replaced, our family's visual history and the love it represents." The letter reminded Jacqueline why the painful legal battle had been worthwhile. Elena's story had rippled outward, protecting families she would never meet and preserving love stories she would never hear. Victoria's attempt to erase Elena's legacy had instead amplified it across the country. As the sun set over St. Paul, Jacqueline sat in her backyard garden, watching Elena Rose chase fireflies while Robert and Linda tended to the memorial roses they'd planted in Elena's honor. The garden was thriving now, full of the flowers Elena had loved and new varieties that Linda had added over the years.
It was a perfect metaphor for their family, rooted in Elena's love, but growing in new directions under Linda's care. Victoria Blackwood had tried to make Elena Martinez forgotten, declaring she's forgotten now as she destroyed irreplaceable family photographs. Instead, she had ensured that Elena's memory would be preserved in legal precedent, protected by state law, honored in academic research, and carried forward by a granddaughter who bore her name and carried her values. Some stories end with justice served and lessons learned. This story ended with something more powerful. Love multiplied across generations, memory transformed into legacy, and the unshakable truth that trying to destroy someone's impact on the world often ensures that impact becomes eternal. Elena Martinez was not forgotten. She never would be. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.